The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and baby powder, a scent that should have felt comforting, but only heightened her anxiety. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, harsh and unyielding, illuminating every crease of her exhausted face. Her hands, still trembling from the whirlwind of labor, clenched the thin hospital blanket as she stared at the tiny figure in the incubator beside her. Her baby had arrived weeks too early, delicate and fragile, a small life hanging by the thinnest of threads. The nurses moved with practiced precision, adjusting monitors and checking vital signs. Their words clipped but gentle. She wanted to speak, to touch, to cradle, but the machines and tubes between them felt like barriers she couldn't cross. The fear in her chest was suffocating, a storm she couldn't calm with deep breaths or whispered prayers. With shaking fingers, she pulled out her phone. She knew her family would want to know, though some were more interested in appearances than in her actual well-being. She typed quickly, her thumbs trembling, "We're in the NICU. Please pray." She hesitated a moment, then pressed send, the message slipping into the digital space where her words might be met with comfort or indifference. Almost immediately, the responses began trickling in. Heartfelt prayers from cousins she hadn't spoken to in years, messages of encouragement from friends, emojis she hadn't realized could carry so much weight. But then there were the ones that made her chest tighten. Terse words, empty sympathies, or delayed replies that reeked of disinterest. Even in this moment, when every second mattered, she felt the sting of distance from the people who were supposed to love her most. Her mother's message was short, almost cold. "Do what you need to do." Her aunt, who had always been jealous of her, responded with a single emoji, an eye roll. Tears stung her eyes, and she turned her face toward the incubator. Her baby's tiny chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, a fragile rhythm that seemed to echo in her own heart. She whispered a soft prayer, holding onto hope as tightly as she could. In this room of sterile walls and beeping machines, love was her only weapon against the fear threatening to consume her. Hours passed in a blur. Nurses checked monitors. Doctors entered with updates that were cautiously optimistic, but never without a hint of warning. She remained by her baby's side, running her fingers along the incubator glass, memorizing every tiny movement, every flutter of fragile life. Each smile that ghosted across her lips was tinged with exhaustion, fear, and an unspoken promise. She would protect this life at any cost, no matter what or who stood in her way. That night, as the hospital settled into quiet, she stared at the phone once more, rereading the responses in the family group chat. Some messages warmed her heart, others ignited a seed of doubt, a flicker of something darker that she couldn't yet name. For now, she let it lie dormant, focusing solely on the life before her, fragile, miraculous, and entirely hers. Days in the NICU blurred into one another. The hum of machines, the sterile smell, the constant beeping. These had become the soundtrack of her life. She spent every waking moment by her baby's side, holding onto the warmth of their tiny fingers, memorizing the rhythm of each breath, praying silently that this fragile life would pull through. But amidst the beeps and whispered encouragements, another sound began to gnaw at her heart, the faint but unmistakable murmur of betrayal. It started with small things. A cousin who had promised to bring supplies for the baby never showed up. Her aunt, who insisted she wanted updates, would call only to offer thinly veiled criticisms about her choices, breastfeeding, sleep schedules, even how she managed visitors. At first she brushed it off, attributing it to stress, exhaustion, and oversensitivity, but soon the pattern became undeniable. Some family members who had rushed to pray in the group chat now whispered behind her back, sharing opinions she had never asked for, questioning her strength and her worth as a mother. Then came the digital sting. She accidentally glimpsed a message in the group chat she hadn't seen before, one of those casual comments that cut deeper than any knife. "Maybe she's overreacting, babies survive all the time." Another said, "We need to be careful, she might not handle this well." The words were framed as concern, but she could feel the contempt behind them like a shadow pressing against her fragile resolve. Her chest tightened. She had expected support, prayers, warmth, anything to lighten the heavy hours she spent watching her baby fight for life. Instead, She discovered that some of those closest to her were watching for weakness, waiting for her to falter. The thought ignited a fire inside her, mingling with the worry for her child. How could anyone be so cold when a life hung in the balance? How could love feel so conditional? Anger and hurt swirled together, a storm threatening to spill over. She wanted to confront them, to demand apologies, to scream until the walls of the hospital echoed with her fury, but she couldn't. Every moment counted here, every second with her baby was precious. She had to stay composed because showing anger now wouldn't help the tiny life she was sworn to protect. Instead, she began watching quietly, collecting fragments of truths hidden behind smiles and polite words. She noticed who avoided her gaze, who whispered when she entered the room, who lingered on her social media posts with thinly veiled judgment. With each observation, a plan started forming, not out of recklessness, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. This betrayal would not go unanswered. She would wait, she would gather. She would strike, but only when the moment was right, only when her baby was safe and the scales could be balanced. For now, she focused on the fragile warmth of the incubator, drawing strength from the tiny life before her. She whispered soft reassurances to her baby, a promise to survive, to protect, and to return love with precision. Somewhere between the beeps and the soft lullabies of the NICU, she made a silent vow. The people who had betrayed her would understand, one way or another, the depth of her resolve, and they would regret underestimating her. The days in the NICU were long, but she began to find a rhythm, a fragile sort of peace in the monotony of monitors, checkups, and whispered lullabies. She learned to read the subtle movements of her baby's tiny chest, to recognize the difference between a shallow flutter and a true struggle. Each breath her child took became a victory, each tiny smile a treasure she would protect at any cost. But beneath the calm, the fire of betrayal still smoldered. She had learned to ignore the empty words of her distant relatives, to shield herself from their subtle criticisms. And yet she watched carefully, like a cat circling an unsuspecting prey. Every half-hearted offer to help, every whispered comment behind her back, every text she stumbled upon, all of it was fuel. She refused to let their cruelty go unnoticed, not when she had the strength to act. In the quiet moments, she began to craft her plan. Nothing rash, nothing impulsive. She knew timing would be everything. First, she would gather evidence. Screenshots of disparaging messages, careful notes of whispered comments, reminders of every slight and every insult. Each piece of information was a thread, weaving a tapestry that would expose the betrayal for all to see. She had learned, in these long, lonely hours, that patience was power. She would strike when the moment was right, when the people who had doubted her least expected it. Even as she plotted quietly, she nurtured a new resilience. The NICU became a place of strength, not weakness. She learned to advocate fiercely for her baby, questioning nurses and doctors when something felt off, refusing to be sidelined in her own child's care. She became a presence impossible to ignore, a mother who would not yield to fear, exhaustion, or judgment. Her eyes hardened with determination, but her hands remained gentle as she held her baby, brushing tiny fingers against her cheek. Allies appeared in unexpected places. A kind nurse who noticed her sharp intelligence and quiet strength began offering subtle guidance, helping her navigate hospital protocols and hinting at ways to protect herself from the gossiping. Relatives, a close friend, trusted and steadfast, became a sounding board for her frustrations, a witness to her pain and quiet triumphs. They offered no judgment, only support, and slowly she realized she wasn't completely alone. At night, she would sit by the incubator, her baby sleeping, her phone resting quietly beside her. She reread the family group chat messages, not for validation, but for understanding. Every careless word, every dismissive emoji, every passive-aggressive remark was a reminder that betrayal often wears the mask of concern. And yet, instead of breaking her, it strengthened her. She whispered promises to her baby, tiny vows carried on trembling lips. "I will protect you, I will survive for you, and when the time comes, those who hurt us will pay." Not with violence, but with the weight of their own shame and guilt. The storm inside her had not passed, it had grown, and in its quiet fury, she found clarity. Resilience was not just survival. It was preparation. And soon, the world would see exactly how fiercely a mother could fight for her child, and herself. The months that followed had hardened her resolve without breaking her tenderness. Her baby grew stronger each day, tiny fingers curling around hers, eyes bright and alert. Every milestone was a victory, every laugh a triumph over the darkness she had endured. And while the world outside continued in its careless routines, she had been quietly shaping hers, patient, deliberate, and sharp as a knife hidden in silk. She didn't act recklessly. The betrayals had been many, but she knew that revenge was most satisfying when it was measured, precise, and undeniable. She began to share updates selectively, offering glimpses of her baby's progress only to those who had shown genuine care. To the others, those who had whispered, judged, and dismissed, she kept her silence, her composure impeccable. Then one evening, a family gathering offered the perfect stage. Invitations had come casually, almost absent-mindedly, but she saw it as the opening she had been waiting for. Dressed simply, calm, radiant with a serenity that masked the storm inside her, she entered the room. Her baby, now strong enough to be safely cradled for a few hours, rested in her arms like a living jewel. The whispers started immediately. Eyes darted, comments floated subtle jabs about her exhaustion, about how miraculous her baby's survival had been. She smiled quietly, nodding politely, letting their words hang in the air, heavy and exposed. Then she began to share her story. Not in anger, not in accusation, but with facts. Screenshots of messages, direct quotes, observations carefully documented over weeks. She spoke slowly, each word deliberate, each detail impossible to ignore. "This is what concern sounds like to me," she said softly, her voice steady, "and this is what betrayal looks like." Faces went pale. The very people who had tried to diminish her now sat trapped by their own words, unable to refute the evidence. Some stammered, others turned away, and a few, who had genuinely cared, reached out in quiet apology. Her calm, unshakable demeanor made their judgment sting all the more. The room, once filled with whispers, fell silent except for the faint coos of her baby nestled against her chest. It wasn't cruelty that fueled her satisfaction, it was justice. She had protected her child, preserved her dignity, and exposed the hypocrisy of those who had pretended to care while quietly undermining her. She had acted without malice, but with the precision of someone who understood that patience amplifies truth. Later, alone in the quiet of her home, she looked down at her sleeping baby. Her heart swelled with love, relief, and an unspoken promise. No harm could touch them again. She whispered softly, brushing tiny fingers against her cheek, "We made it, and they will never forget." The storm of betrayal had passed. What remained was the calm strength of a mother who had endured, survived, and triumphed, not through anger, but through quiet resilience and the undeniable force of truth. And as she held her baby close, she knew the sweetest revenge of all was living well, loving fiercely, and never letting anyone dim the light they had fought so hard to protect.